dominance of African genetic traits would warrant then the Africanization of the other peoples engaged. And this is an important point which should not be lost when one considers a common Western assertion that the Moors were mixed and not just African. From a psychological standpoint, it might also be argued that as a genetically dominant African people, the Moors would have harbored less innate fear of peoples with differing phenotypes than would a people with recessive traits. Essentially, I'm moving into what Dr. Francis Cress Welsing alludes to, and what Public Enemy had alluded to, fear of a black planet. This same relative lack of fear among such African peoples as the Moors would probably also be true of several Asiatic and Asian-based peoples, again, as opposed to the typical European who was fully aware of his recessive traits. Consequently, we should not be surprised to find such Islamic peoples of Africa and Asia freely intermarrying with various peoples and not seeking or needing to develop or systematize theories of inherent racial supremacy. After all, the progenitive truth and supremacy of the African's gene pool was evident via his or her ability to make European traits disappear. Moors, as with other Africans, could in short afford to be and were more concerned with a people's level of ethics or their value system than they were with their physical appearance. But unfortunately, as Africa's Moors mixed their blood and their fate with that of these less ethical, more resource-oriented, more materialistic Europeans, the Moors acquired the less noble traits of their less noble in-laws. They became more materialistic and more color conscious. In the case of Andalusia's Moors, their allegiance was often fragmented, as some Moors forged alliances with Catholic European kin against other Moors. This was being done at a time when Catholic powers were establishing a more unified front and a greater unity of purpose, which was to pursue the Moors and to take what they had. A number of Moorish rulers, such as Al-Hakam, who lived between 796 and 822 of the Common Era, even held mercenary armies composed of Catholic Europeans, a situation reminiscent of Semiticus in ancient Egypt, who had held Greek mercenaries in the Egyptian army. Lines of allegiance became skewed and internecine conflicts occurred. African ethnic and Islamic sects, such as the West African-based Moors known as the Almoravids and the Almohads, fought against one another, thereby weakening the ability of Africa in general to resist encroachment by resource-starved Europeans. Ironically, it was a European historian, a Frenchman, named Henri Coppi, who asserted that the Moors lost control of their territories in Andalus as they abandoned, and I'm quoting him, their noble natures. Coppi suggested that the Moors of Andalus underwent a negative change within these Western surroundings. Coppi says the Moors exchanged Moorish virtues for Spanish vices and Moorish activity for Spanish indolence. The few exceptions, and I, again, trying to be honest, the few exceptions, if you look at the history of Spain, Alfonso X, also known as El Sabio, was one of very few Catholic Europeans who actually tried to display a greater sense of humanity and fairness in dealing with the Moors. Alfonso X passed something called the Siete Partidas, or the 6 parts, which specifically said that any people taken in slavery are to be recognized as humans, and that their labor is owned and not their bodies. So again, you know, as a historian, if you find evidence of credit, you give credit where credit is due. African, that's my understanding. The rise of Catholic power and the Reconquista produced a concentrated effort to erase the influence of Moorish culture and to forbid the use of Arabic, which many of the Moors, of course, spoke, as a medium of written or spoken expression. This, too, contributed to a loss of knowledge in the Western world about the profound role of these Islamic peoples in raising the level of Western and, in fact, human civilization. According to the Catholic priest and historian Robert Ignatius Burns, the African Muslims, i.e. the Moors, suffered more legal restrictions regarding their access to trade than did the Jews. Now, in pointing that out, let me also clarify something. When we talk about Jews today in 1997, we're talking about people usually who are Ashkenazi. We're talking about people who are descendants of Poles, Germans, Russians, Englishmen, who are essentially converts to Judaism. When we're talking about Jews at this time, we're talking about Sephardim, we're talking about Beta Israel, also known as quote-unquote Falashim or Falasha, who are clearly African and Asiatic. So keep in mind, because one of the things that happens, unfortunately, with much of Western history is when Europeans see anything of value, they co-opt it. You have to do that in a white supremacist society. You cannot allow something of value to be coming from the people who you have deemed as valueless. So what do? You then take on the accoutrements of that thing, and if there are no cries to the contrary from the people, you get away with it. But my assertion is, if you take my coat and you wear my coat for 12 years, it's still my coat. And I may ask for it back or take it back. And essentially, and I'll get into this a little bit more as I proceed, we need to recognize that we're empowered, as we're doing now, to learn as much as we can so that we can take back what is ours and not feel uncomfortable making these assertions. Legal prohibitions against Moorish or Muslim surgeons, physicians, and pharmacists are instituted between 1322 and 1465. In 1412, merchants, carpenters, butchers, tailors are no longer trades allowed to the Moorish Muslims. All these prohibitions illustrate the level of participation which the Moors held within Andalusian and then later Spanish society. You have a situation where, as the Catholic powers in Spain and in Portugal begin to ascend, they begin then to try to limit the access of the Moors to their livelihoods. And of course, they're breaking them economically and ultimately politically. Church officials consistently suppressed the Moorish presence and Moorish influence. Any pledges which had been made to the Moors, any contracts that had been made with the Moors by Spanish Catholics were deemed null and void by Cardinal Jimenez de Cisneros in the 15th century. He declared that Catholics need not keep contractual agreements which they've made with Moorish Muslims. In the late 15th century, as a result of these nullifications, the Catholic Kingdom of Spain and Portugal makes a financial killing because they're able legally to get out of any agreements in terms of purchasing of land, in terms of anything that was made. And then at the same time, you have the establishment of what's called the Spanish Inquisition, which goes out and takes the property of accused heretics, of course, and those would include the Moors, in order to, as they said, to defray court costs. But they never gave these lands, or never gave the property back, even after the court case was